Well,
Well,
hello.
good evening. Hey, Ron, how's it going tonight?
It's a Monday, and you're on my screen, so I assume it's time for another Monday Night Monsters Mystery and Mayhem, or whatever the
It
show's
is
called.
indeed. Hey, David, welcome aboard. Nice to have you here with us tonight. Ron, by the way, I noticed you got some really cool posters behind you. I can't tell if those are horror movie posters or docs, but some really cool stuff behind you there.
These are conferences that I attended.
Very, very cool. Love that.
Oh,
Love that bold design. All right.
thank you very much. I am, however, going to bring up some books in my background because I do like yours very much. I've been trying to find forever, and you might know where I could get one of these. One of those looks almost like a Tesla coil they use in the old Frankenstein movies, where the electricity goes up and down. That would be so awesome to have in
Oh,
the
they call it
background.
a Jacob's ladder. I love those things. Get
Is
a
that
little
Jacob's ladder? I also
Frankenstein.
remember that.
Yeah, got a lot of little Frankenstein action going on back there. You can get what do they call a Van de Graaff generator with the big sphere and everything.
Absolutely, man. I can have it going on back here.
I'd love to see that. So, well, guys out there, welcome aboard. See, we got a whole bunch of people jumping in tonight. Hey, John, John Suberman there, good longtime friend of mine who actually suggested this evening's topic. And it's a really intriguing topic. And I'm not going to lie to you. We were just talking a few minutes before the broadcast that when the topic was first suggested, sometimes we have topics on here. And when I start to pull together the slides and the sort of graphics for the show, I wonder, is there enough material here to do an hour-long talk? And sometimes I feel like it's not going to happen. And time and time again, when I start to do the research, I find there is so much here. There's so many interesting wrinkles and folds and sort of dark nooks and crannies to some of these topics that it just gets away with me. And half the time, at the end of these things, we end up rushing through slides because we're trying to get through our topic. But I think tonight is going to be a really fascinating subject.
I think it's going to be cool as well too, because we're going to bring up a little bit of the past, a lot of modern day stuff. We're going to be connecting some dots, so I'm excited to get rocking and rolling.
Very good. And one of the things that's interesting is that throughout the course of all of our episodes, we've done a lot. Hey, Cody, nice to see you. Always welcome aboard. One of the things that's really interesting is that we often talk about the sort of clash of cultures between, and Mary Beth, again, always good to see you. Clash of cultures between sort of the Christianization of the world and pre-Christian religions and things like that. And tonight we're actually going to pretty heavily focus on Christian traditions, because the subject of pacts with Satan or pacts with sort of dark forces, while not exclusively Christian, they do have a kind of a special weight or significance in Christian tradition. And most of the stories that we're familiar with and have become familiar with over the years of these kind of tales do come from Christian tradition. So it's going to be talk a lot about sort of biblical tradition and things like that tonight. So it is going to be a fascinating topic.
It's hard to make a pact with somebody you don't believe in.
Well, certainly true, but I mean, we are going to discuss the fact that there are darker sort of cosmic forces in earlier religions as well, who sort of held this role. But it is true that sort of Christian Christian cosmology kind of perfected this idea of God and the devil, and they certainly have run with it over the course of the last few millennia.
That's right. All right, my friend. So where are we starting at? How deep are we going down this rabbit hole?
We're going to go pretty deep down the rabbit hole, but we're going to actually start with a couple of really good examples of what we would call, a sort of a pact with the devil story, because they have a large place in literature, of course. Literature and movies and things are one of the places that we're nowadays familiar, because not that many people these days seem to be making active pacts with Satan, although there's a couple of politicians out there I do wonder about. But I'd like to start with one that I've always found fascinating, and that is the 1891 novel, or actually novella, called The Picture of Dorian Gray. So in 1891, provocative and very controversial writer Oscar Wilde, who many of us are familiar with for stories like Dorian Gray and The Canterville Ghost, he published The Picture of Dorian Gray. It was serialized originally and then ended up being published as a novel. But it was a story about a beautiful young man who's young, he's wealthy, he's got extraordinary good looks, the sort of person who turns heads everywhere he goes. And he encounters an artist by the name of Basil, and Basil offers to paint a portrait of him. And he paints the portrait. And when Dorian looks upon this portrait of himself, he literally falls in love with his own picture, and he finds it so exquisite that he looks at the painting and he thinks to himself, if only I could stay this beautiful for all time, and the painting would age instead of me. And the story, of course, goes on to have exactly that happen. And as the painting decays and ages, Dorian stays perfect. But in this perfect state, as someone who, again, is so beautiful and so privileged, he finds that not having to worry about the ravages of age and not having to worry about sort of the decline of life, that he can take advantage of every pleasure imaginable. And so he effectively becomes this lustful, gluttonous, sinful, amoral person. And the more and more time progresses, the more the painting literally degenerates into this dreadful thing, and Dorian stays perfect until, of course, as all of these stories seem to go, at the end, it all does catch up to him, and all of his sins, all of his debauchery and degradation catch up to him in a terrible, grim, climactic ending. And it is a very heavy-handed story because it's about the wages of sin and sort of the cost of amorality. But it was both a very popular and incredibly controversial book. The book had elements of not only some fairly overt sexuality, but also implications of homosexuality and in Victorian England that didn't fly. And so it was considered to be both offensive and obscene, and the book caused quite a stir. But it was probably one of the first sort of big sort of literary adaptations of what we would call a Faustian bargain. And so we're going to talk a little bit about what that means in a moment or two. But there's one more example I want to jump into before we discuss what exactly a Faustian bargain is, because there's a more contemporary story, and this one is actually based on some real history. So back in the 1930s, a blues player by the name of Robert Johnson, we call this a latter-day Faustian tale. Robert Johnson penned about 30 songs, and one of them was a very, very popular song by the name of Crossroads that had some kind of interesting lyrics in it. And those lyrics ended up giving rise to a legend, because Johnson himself had a very short life. He became very, very well known. He was considered a master of the blues, but he came on the scene out of nowhere, and he died at a very young age under mysterious circumstances. And that has led to a legend. And in that legend, they say that Johnson actually met the devil at a crossroads, and he offered his soul up in exchange for the power to become this legendary blues musician. But of course, as with almost any bargain of this kind, didn't quite work out in his favor. The devil's always been a trickster, and so Johnson died before his success could bring him any real financial benefit, and he died largely unknown. His success didn't happen until after he died. And again, a very distinctly Faustian story, and one that uses, I think, one of the great metaphors or great sort of symbols that you see in these legends, which is the crossroads. The crossroads being effectively a symbol of the meeting place between worlds, between life and death, between goodness and evil, and heaven and hell. And so crossroads tend to figure throughout folklore in a lot of these legends. So we're going to talk about these and how they connect to what we refer to as Faustian myth.
Yeah, we can even go back to the Greeks, though, because the crossroads was the veneration spot for Hecate, which we get nowadays. You know, she's the goddess of witchcraft, the goddess of oaths, the goddess of the crossroads. So it's very interesting to see that even in a Judeo-Christian standpoint, we still rely on Greek iconography in order to really sell these points home. But yeah, just like we have with Dorian Gray, Robert Johnson was promised not only the ability to play the blues like no other man, but he was also promised to have all the alcohol and women that he could possibly want as well too. So like Dorian Gray, we see that they not only want to have some sort of skill, but they want to live a life that's full of debauchery. And that's another tale that is always told when we have a Judeo-Christian standpoint, right? We have to have some sort of structuralism. We have to have that juxtaposition between the good and the bad, the kind of the devil on your shoulder, like we're going to get to a little bit later. But yes, so to iron it out, that's my little 2 cents whenever it comes to this.
And it's interesting too, because we're going to talk about the fact that some Faustian stories do take a little bit of a different approach to it, and that as it became kind of a cultural staple, different versions of the story, different some were adaptations, some were just reinterpretations of the story, and the idea of the sort of intent of the bargain maker kind of becomes a significant factor. But both of these stories are specifically examples of the Faustian myth, and this is actually based on a real live human being who lived in the 15th century. He was an astrologer, a mystic, and a sort of an alchemist by the name of Johann Georg Faust. And his seemingly magical powers, some people suggest that he was a charlatan, some people suggest that he had true magical powers, but his powers and his fame were such that he was often rumored to have made a pact with the devil. And interestingly enough, although he is believed to have been a historical figure, historians do remain divided on whether or not he was genuinely a single individual, or if he was an amalgam. This Faust character was an amalgam of several historic figures who all dabbled in arcane research. And in the Middle Ages, this was something that was fairly common, as sort of the grip of theocracy had begun to recede a little bit. A lot of these scientists, or people who practice early sciences like alchemy and astrology, began to rise to the forefront, and they were experimenting with sorcery and all these kind of things. And they certainly made people a little bit nervous, because they were playing with what people often considered to be divine or diabolical forces. And so a lot of these legends ended up rising up around them, and Dr. Faustus has become now kind of the sort of the archetype. He's the sort of the poster child for these devilish bargains. By the way, they would publish his story in later years in little chapbooks and novelizations that were very similar to the Victorian era penny dreadfuls, which sold stories of horror and the occult to the general populace for usually just a few pennies. The most famous version of Faustus's story, or one of the more famous versions, was actually written by one of Shakespeare's contemporaries in the late 1500s, and that was Christopher Marlowe. But the tragical history and life and death of Dr. Faustus remains sort of the core text of the Faust legend.
And it's probably appropriate too that Christopher Marlowe would write that, because he was known to indulge a little bit on the whenever he was off work as well too. So
I think most of those poets were poets and playwrights were a bit on the debauched side.
yes, but you know what? He died. He was killed in a bar fight.
Was he killing the bar fight?
He
Well,
was killed in a bar fight. Yeah,
that's pretty classic then. That is
that's right. That's right. But if you would think about, doctors at this particular time, they would seem to be a bit magical. And if they were going down the wrong road and possibly even looking at some cadavers and such, they could be seen as having some sort of witchcraft involved. Because whenever sciences are not understood by people and religion has some sort of tone about what you can and cannot study, bad things can come from that, especially if you go down that wrong road. And even though you're trying to heal people, it could still seem like an act of witchcraft. So you have the idea that somebody's doing remarkable things that the common person doesn't understand, therefore he must be in league with the devil.
Well, this was a fairly common theme at that time, and actually,
absolutely.
Last week's show, when we were talking about sort of Celtic gods and goddesses and magic, we did touch a little bit on the Christianization of Europe, and the fact that many of these sort of magical ideas were demonized and vilified by the Christian Church, and the 1500s was kind of the great sort of final clamp of Christianity on the Western world. It took close to 1,000 years, truthfully, for Christianity to spread across Europe from the death of Christ in 33 or so Anno Domini, or after Common Era, as we call it. Christianity didn't simply burst into existence and cover the world at that time. Christianity had to grow and had to sort of rise. It started out as a small cult, as often religions do, and it grew beyond that. But it took hundreds of years as it began to slowly coalesce throughout what would become the Roman Empire, throughout the Near East, into Eastern Europe, into the West, and finally into the British Isles. And by about 1200 or 1300 AD, just a little bit before Marlowe's time, before the legend of Dr. Faustus, Christianity had finally become the official, not only religion of the Roman Empire, which was just dying out at that time, but also had really finally subsumed Europe. But while theocracies were losing their grip on the minds of the people, which led to the rise of these sort of sorcerer philosophers like Faustus, it was certainly still a political power. And this is when the heresy trials that we talked about last week really began to get underway. So believing in or practicing this kind of magic was a very dangerous thing. So the story of Faustus was not only a morality play, but it was a real cautionary tale about the wages of trafficking with the devil.
Right. And also Protestant is starting to make its inroads as well too. 1517 with Martin Luther. So now we have the idea that the church itself is being, challenged. And so these ideas of challenges coming up and rising, and the time whenever we're going from the focus on God to a more cosmopolitan focus, and the focus now comes on the common man, and the common man left to his own devices can do dangerous things. The whole idea that the idle hands are the devil's workplace, and we can still see some of this stuff in what was going on as well too, because as the church loses its grip more and more on the common person, some of the things which the common person is now doing seems to be more and more evil.
And this is a point where, again, learned men, at one point, learned men were almost all clergy. They were clergy, or they were monks, or they were, theologians of some kind. And now we had this class of these learned men who were the alchemists and who were the scientists. The idea is that all these certainly weren't popular notions at the time, and often could get you, imprisoned or executed. It was sort of the rise of the beginning of the sort of age of reason. It wasn't quite there yet, but it was just about to strike. And the idea of the belief in the pursuit of natural sciences, which was considered pretty diabolical by the church at that time, and certainly the church did hold all the political power in that age.
Trying to prove that the earth revolved around the sun could definitely get you killed, and in Galileo's case, in prison for life. So simple notions such as this that we take for granted nowadays could put you in some serious harm.
Absolutely. I mean, the beliefs about the idea that the sun was at the center of our solar system, and that there were planets and other galaxies out there, which people like Galileo were just beginning to explore those ideas. Or in fact, the idea that the earth was round was like putting words in God's mouth and going against the will of the church. And that was definitely a dangerous proposition, and got more than a few of these philosophers sent to the gallows, or occasionally burned at the stake. And we'll talk a little bit about that habit later on. But one of the interesting things that arose, sort of beginning in this time, was this notion of pacts with the devil. It wasn't a kind of thing that was really a part of a folklore or belief before that, because why, especially in a highly theocratic world, would anyone believe that anyone would make a pact with the devil? And so the idea was largely considered ludicrous. So we have to ask ourselves, in fact, where did this deal with the devil idea originate? And as I mentioned early on, it certainly didn't completely start with the Christians. There were belief systems, and there were cultures where dark forces, cosmic entities like the jinn of the Persian countries and the Middle East, like the daemons of ancient Greek. We've discussed these in previous episodes. Had cosmic power and the ability to grant wishes and make people immortal and all these different things. And there were certainly sorcerers and practitioners of magic in those ancient legends who trucked with these cosmic beings. But it is very true that the Christians in some ways perfected this idea, because the Christians, the Christian equivalent of these great cosmic sort of dark forces was Lucifer, the light bringer. Now, Lucifer, of course, was the fallen angel. He was once the first of the Christian gods, angels and lieutenants. Having questioned, however, why he was secondary to God, he ends up being expelled from heaven and sent down to become the Lord of Hell. But this dark sort of fallen angel becomes, in a way, the anti-God. Now, Christian theology on this can be a little bit confusing, because I think many people see God and the devil as these complete polar opposites, as if they are two sides of the same coin. However, in Christian theology, it's also the truth that God created Lucifer, and that Lucifer had begun as an angel. So they're not like twin brothers of opposite powers. Lucifer is meant in even the most sort of simplified version to be subservient to God. In fact, in a way, serves a primary purpose. Otherwise, he would have simply, one has to presume, have wiped Lucifer out of existence, sort of winked him out of being. But instead, he gives him domain over hell. And strangely enough, that meant domain over the earthly realm. And so Lucifer kind of became the patron god of human fallibility. And this is the god whose purpose was to entice us. His purpose was to sort of summon our basest desires and get us to break God's law. So in a way, he was a foil for God, but also, I suppose, in a way, kind of like a rat catcher. He was the one who was out there to trip up the bad people and, I guess, sort us from the good.
Yeah, he's still doing God's will. He's still doing God's will, even though he's thrown out of heaven. Absolutely.
And while Lucifer is most often, I think, portrayed in so many of these, especially in these medieval times, as a hideous creature, back in those days, largely sort of lizard-like or reptilian with wings and tusks and things like that, it's always been a part of the Lucifer legend that Lucifer has the ability to appear in a comely form, and that he was always, of course, the tempter. And so if this, a horrible, slimy, lizard-like creature comes and says, hey, you want to make a deal with me, not many people are going to fall for that. And so Lucifer often sort of adopted his light bringer personality, the sort of beautiful angelic being who could come to you and promise you something better in most cases than you were supposed to believe that God was offering. So this light bringer idea, this beautiful angelic being was the sort of public face, the PR face of Lucifer, and one of the reasons that he became such a master manipulator and such a well-known deceiver, certainly deceptive enough to convince quite a lot of people, according to folklore, to shake his hand and sign a contract.
I think that's a good point that you made, though, because you can pray to God all you want, but God is never going to promise you to be beautiful or to be rich. He's going to promise to be there through all the temptations in this life, and promises you everlasting life and salvation within his kingdom. But he never promises you all these worldly goods that we are in so desperate need of, right? When we look at, life as it is, sometimes it can be very difficult. And we see this, probably one of the first times we ever see this is in the Bible, whenever Jesus is being tempted by the devil, which is, in a way, one of the first types of literary interaction with trying to tempt somebody over to give me what I want and nobody gets hurt type of thing. But to promise Jesus all the powers of the land, all the temporal powers, and at the end, Jesus refuses that. That's really the first case that we see of the devil trying to tempt somebody over to gain somebody's soul. And after that, he's now set loose to try to get all of humanity over onto his side. But it's easy to think about doing this because the God that we believe in, that the God that we that has power over us in these societies that we're talking about, isn't going to give us instantaneous satisfaction. And indeed, the satisfaction he gives us might not be until after we die. At least the devil gives us something to hold on to in this world.
100% correct on that. And actually, I'm jumping the gun a little because I wanted to discuss it a little bit later. We will get to it. But one of the interesting things about the rise of the Abrahamic religions, Christianity, Islam, Christianity, certainly among Judaism, among the primary Abrahamic religions, is that they were rising and sort of coming into their own in a period of time when like Greek culture, Roman culture was about hedonism. It was about the pursuit of sex and wealth and all these different things. And the Abrahamic religions took a very, very different course. The idea that the pleasures of the flesh, that you have the idea of the 7 deadly sins and everything else. All of these ideas is that they were to be suppressed, and that those natural desires were somehow base. In fact, interestingly enough, again, the idea that Lucifer being sort of the god of earthly desires and things like that, and that they were considered to be dark desires, and as much as possible, you were expected to suppress them or not experience them. So God didn't represent a comfortable life or all the gold you ever wanted. God represented a pure soul and often a very hard life. And so that gave the devil something pretty powerful to work with, because let's face it, those base desires for, for love and sex and wealth and food and all these kind of things are pretty darn compelling, and not many humans can resist them.
Hey, sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's what makes the world go round, right?
Absolutely. So this whole notion of the devil on your shoulder eternally lurking to tempt you into wicked behavior, it's a very old one, and it is a staple of Western culture. It exists in literature, and we see it all the time. In fact, this trope is used constantly in movies, whether they're comedy, horror, or spooky stories told around a campfire. So this sort of lurking devil idea has always been a part of our culture, and really still is today. And it's interesting, you said that in the Bible, you've got, of course, the legendary scene of the devil coming to tempt Jesus in the desert. There is one earlier temptation story that's pretty significant, and I suppose from a biblical perspective or an Abrahamic perspective, it's probably the first official episode of Let's Make a Deal with the Devil, and that is, of course, the story of Adam and Eve, the great first, sort of the sort of first name story in Genesis, at the beginning of the Bible. Now, one of the interesting things about Adam and Eve is that I've always been fascinated by this story, because, like a lot of biblical metaphors, it doesn't quite play out the way people tend to see it. People tend to tell the story that Adam and Eve were, walking in the Garden of Eden, and Satan came to them in the form of a snake and said, come eat of this apple, and tempted them. And, because of that temptation, giving into the devil, that they, were cast out of Eden. And people tend to tell a very simplified version of the story. But it's interesting, because it doesn't really play out that way. And some of the events that play out in the story of Adam and Eve actually kind of go against what your, average run-of-the-mill I would call a three-sprinkle Christian, the one that goes to church when they're baptized, when they're married, and when they die, but don't really spend a lot of time there elsewhere. But the way that these people tend to see it is a very simplified version, not necessarily accurate. But so in the story of Adam and Eve, of course, Eve is the first woman, and she is convinced by a serpent to disobey God's command and eat of the fruit of the tree of knowledge. But interestingly enough, so God has commanded Adam and Eve that they can eat of any tree in the Garden of Eden, except the fruit of the tree of knowledge. And he says, "For on that day you shall surely die." But the serpent comes to Eve and says that this is not true, that on the day you eat of it, you won't die, you will become aware. And if you do that, you can go on and eat of the fruit of the tree of life. And that will make you like a god, like unto God. And Eve is tempted by this, of course, because it's a pretty exciting offer. And so she goes ahead and she takes a bite of this fruit. And then she becomes self-aware, realizes the sort of the power that she has. And then she goes and she offers it to Adam, who eats as well. God arrives and sees what they have done, and he says, now you've disobeyed me, you've eaten of the fruit of the tree of knowledge, now I have to cast you from Eden before you eat of the fruit of the tree of life and become, and this is exactly how it's phrased in the Bible, it's not in English, of course, it's probably started out in Aramaic, but before you become like unto me, like unto gods. He literally says to them that now that you have the knowledge, I've got to cast you out of Eden before you become gods. It's a fascinating sort of twist of the story that very few people seem to relate. But the other part of it is that there is never a reference in any way in the story to the idea that the serpent is the devil. We've come to believe that, and we do tend to associate serpents with these sort of satanic ideas, but he simply refers to him as a serpent. And the best evidence that you have that it's only meant to be a serpent, a creature, possibly one with malevolent intent or malicious intent, but only a serpent, is that when God confronts the serpent, he says to him, for what you've done, I'm going to curse you and all your progeny, to crawl on your belly like an animal, and that from now to the end of time, all of your kind are going to, be feared by women. Women will strike it, will crush your head, and you'll strike at their heels, blah, blah, blah. He's talking to an animal and referring to what will become of snakes. He's not talking to, he doesn't say, you trickster, go back to hell or anything like that. So it is fascinating that the story of Adam and Eve has become kind of cartoonified and twisted by a pop culture interpretation that really doesn't reflect the things that happen. So I've always found the story fascinating for that reason.
It is, and I think it's not until the time you actually get to Milton in the 1600s with his Paradise Lost that we really see this coming together in a very focused initiative of making the devil into the snake in the Garden of Eden. Although, of course, there is a tradition that goes back that's fairly ancient. But yeah, absolutely, we have the idea even of Satan in the Old Testament as almost as a criminal lawyer, somebody who is a prosecutor, who kind of is that person that tries to act on the behalf of a prosecutor, and God is kind of like the judge. So the devil, or Satan in and of himself, within the Old Testament, is never seen as somebody that has been damned to hell. Actually, he can roam around the courts of heaven if he wanted to.
Right. And in fact, the Bible is quite specific that these are two entirely different beings. People can always assume that both Lucifer and Satan are the same being. And not only are they not the same being, but their jobs, their location, everything are entirely different. Exactly as you say, Lucifer, the fallen star, the light bringer, is the becomes sort of the ruler in hell. Satan, or Shaitan, is the prosecuting attorney, while Jesus stands at God's right hand and reads from the book of life and tries at the judgment time, is the one who speaks in favor of your soul, tells God what was good about you and why you might deserve to get into heaven. And Shaitan, or Satan's entire purpose, was to read from the basically the book of lies and explain to God what you've done wrong in your life, and then they would weigh these two things. And so he's the prosecuting attorney, but he serves a primary purpose again, and is certainly Satan in the sense that he's the one who speaks against you. So he's not a particularly likable character, but this is not the devil. The devil, if anything, would be Lucifer, because he's the one who presides over hell. But people have always confused Satan and Lucifer as well. So again, it's this idea that in sort of the three sprinkle Christian cosmology, where they've squished these two characters together and tried to make them into a single figure. Mm-hmm. So of course, to jump back to Adam and Eve for a moment, so the consequences of their events is that, which, by the way, extremely significant to the Abrahamic religions, is that they are cast out of paradise. Basically, they'll never know paradise again, which I like to think, metaphorically speaking, means that they'll never know the sort of peace and simplicity of living that life oblivious. Now that they have eaten from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they're self-aware. They metaphorically recognize that they're naked, and God casts them out. But this had a very, very significant impact on Christianity, Judaism, Islam, etc., because it also sets up the image of women as corruptible and corrupters. She basically gets she gets to take the rap for this, because she falls prey to the serpent, she falls prey to corruption, and it's the woman who corrupts Adam. And so this lays the groundwork for what would become the sort of patriarchal idea that women were weak, that women were much more susceptible to the devil, and we're going to see that carry forward all the way up. Really, we're still see it today, but certainly into times like the witch trials and things like that, when women were specifically vilified and thought to be much more inclined to throw their lot in with the devil.
Right, that's a good point. So whenever I brought up Milton earlier, John Milton, 1600s, of course, he did not exist in a vacuum, so he was borrowing on other traditions, of course. But in his Paradise Lost, the moment we see the serpent in the Garden of Eden, it takes on a very phallic symbolism, right? The words that he uses, it gesticulates. It kind of gets Eve all kind of hot and bothered, if you will. So he's borrowing on traditions that women are very weak and are easily susceptible to any kind of demonic, I guess, intentions, if you will.
Yeah, and the thing is that today, one of the most common things that you get among some fairly extreme, Christian sects is the idea that the Bible has got to always be interpreted literally, and that it is the definitive word of God. But that's a very difficult argument to make, because even biblical scholars fully understand that the Bible has been translated and translated again and translated again. And any two copies of a Bible that you find, even in a bookstore, are likely to be different translations. And and these translations often very, very significantly affect the sort of the gist of passages. We have, for instance, oh gosh, I can't believe I've lost the name of this king, very famous king. Oh, King James, of course. Who, because of his prejudice against the idea of witchcraft during these burning times, thought the idea that the Bible didn't specifically speak out against witches the way he saw them. You had what we call the Witch of Endor, who was more of a prophetess, but overall he thought that witches should be called out in the Bible. And so there was a passage in the Bible that said that thou shalt not suffer one who poisons to live. And this was poisoners in this case. The word that poisoners did refer to women, because it was believed at that time that poison was a woman's weapon, where a blade might be a man's weapon. But he had them reinterpret poisoners and make it witches. And so it became thou shalt not suffer a witch to live, which, as you can imagine, ended up having a pretty significant impact on later persecution of people accused of witchcraft, most of whom were not witches in any form. But these translations of the Bible over the course of the last 1,000 or more years have significantly changed the content of some of these passages. And it's hard to say that it's the word of God when the word of man has supplanted so many of these original ideas.
Yeah, it really depends upon who you hate, because depending upon which group you hate, you can pretty much make any verse in the Bible, over onto what you want us to talk about, which is kind of scary, because I think if I'm going to make a pact with anybody, making a pact with a human being, I think, is far more frightening than making a pact with the devil.
That's a lot more likely to have real-time consequences in any case.
That's right. That's right.
I mentioned earlier that I had a slide on this subject, and we've addressed it already a little bit, but it's interesting to note that a recurring theme in many temptation stories is a warning against succumbing to the sins of earthly pleasures. And this makes sense because Greek and Roman cultures were so focused on, hedonism, the bacchanalias and things like that. In fact, very specific Greek gods like Pan and Dionysus were all about sexual gratification, about drinking, and these were the gods of joy and the gods of pleasure. But this was an idea that was considered anathema to sort of a good, clean, wholesome Christian life. And so that's one of the reasons, and we discussed this pretty specifically last week when we were talking about Cernunnos, the horned god of Celtic cultures, that these horned goat gods and sort of ungulate gods ended up becoming the pattern for the new devil, and the leathery demonic bat-winged devil that had been so common ends up being replaced by what we call the goat of Mendes, these horned goat gods that were a symbol of both evil and of sort of sexual temptation, because the rutting of goats was something that was already sort of metaphorically considered very sexual. But the demonization of pleasure became a big part of what would become sort of the Christian moral view. So the decadent hedonism of the Greeks and Romans became the epitome of a sinful life, and these new religions would strive to suppress those urges as a central tenet of their faiths. And that is something that, unfortunately, you do still see, very commonly today. We were talking, recently about things like the censoring the Statue of David, so that now, in Florida, where Governor DeSantis, has passed all these various edicts about what you can and cannot say in schools, and now they're firing teachers for, doing classical studies in which you perceive ancient, centuries old or millennia old statues that depict human nudity, as if somehow the natural human body is a thing of evil, or again, something we discussed earlier is the even the banning of things like drag shows and things like that, as if somehow this is more dangerous to children than all the other terrible things. Of course, we had another school shooting down in Nashville today, and the idea that there's this skewed idea that violence is somehow less of a concern than hedonism and sexuality, which at the very least is something that virtually everyone pursues.
Right. I think that if anybody wants to get really to the bottom of this making deals with the devil, and if you want to see it in action, go to Washington, D.C. and hang around lobbyists for a while.
Yeah,
I think that's as close as you're getting to anything like this.
I think their shoes smolder when they walk through the halls of Congress.
Absolutely, yes. So in a way, the idea of the deal with the devil, I mean, if we bring it up into the 21st century, it's very easily seen as an allusion to all the evils that people are capable of doing. A lot of times on our show we encounter monsters, and when we take off the mask, it's the human being involved. And I think a lot of this has to tell, has a telling too, that we are dealing with very human consequences here. If you give over to lust and you give over to temptations, for instance, our buddy Robert Johnson, who made a deal with the devil, and the devil said he was supposed to give him all the alcohol and women he could possibly consume. It is said that he died of syphilis-related illness. So a lot of these morality tales that we're talking about here, a lot of these deals with the devil, we are basically making deals with ourselves, and our bodies are the one that's cashing the paycheck. We like to blame the supernatural. We like to blame things, that go bump in the night. But at the end of the day, my friends, we are them, right? He is us. It's kind of like when Mick Jagger sings "Sympathy for the Devil." Pleased to meet you. I understand your name, but we're in this with you as well too. You're not acting by yourself.
And it's interesting because I think in defense on some level of early Christian theology, there is a such thing as sort of healthy morality, the idea that excess in any form tends to be bad, and that an excess of drink, an excess of hedonism, an excess of food, the 7 deadly sins often refer to things that are that in excess, like gluttony isn't simply eating, it's eating to excess. Lord knows I've got a big tummy on me, and I'm well aware of that particular sin. But there is a sensible perspective on all of these things. The problem is with anything, it's when it becomes extremism. And because religion tends to talk in such extremes, basically the idea of heaven or hell, heaven or damnation, salvation or damnation, it becomes a really extreme perspective, and people take it to unnatural extremes. And those unnatural extremes are no healthier than the vice that they're trying to suppress. So fast forwarding all of this suppression of lust and suppression of desire into the early Middle Ages, you had the time when, instead of Satan and his wiles being a spiritual concern, it began to be a much more literal concern, again taking the idea to an extreme. And it was at this time that the idea that the forces of godliness had to contend with the literal manifestation of the devil on earth. And so, no longer intangible, now came the idea that the devil actually walked among us and could approach us with an offer of eternal life, all the women and drink you want, in order for whatever your heart's desire was. And this is, I think, where these literal interactions between humans and demons and the devil themselves began to rise. And interestingly enough, it's also a time when the division between man and woman was sort of codified in terms of what temptations they were supposedly prey to. So women were often portrayed as weak. They were vain, lustful, petty, and unfaithful. They were often referred to, of course, the weaker sex, or the fairer sex. Often, or the weaker sex is something that was a common concept back then. Men, on the other hand, had these sort of manly vices. They were prideful, they were greedy, wrathful, and gluttonous. More like active, more physical vices. And so the form in which demonic tempters came to men and women had that same divide. In fact, it was often believed that women were much more likely to be to fall prey to sexual demons, what we call often a succubus. There is or an incubus rather. There's the succubus, which is the female version, which supposedly preyed on men, but women were almost exclusively thought to be preyed upon by demons that preyed on their vanity and their lustfulness. And men, on the other hand, were often given what I would call sort of the diabolical benefit of the doubt, and it was believed that they were looking for, again, more manly pursuits, such as scholarly knowledge, power, and things like that. And so when men encountered demons, rather than being seduced by them, men were often out there trying to sign contracts that would get them wealth, that would get them, huge castles, powerful positions, in their kingdom or what have you. And this was a pretty distinctive difference, because they were portrayed both mythically, in literature, and in sermons as being prey to very, very different forms of vice.
Yeah, when we talk about Faust, that was his whole thing, right? I mean, when we look at the plays and the books based upon it, he wanted to be able to see into history. He wanted to be able to ask historical figures, their opinions on things, and he wanted to master the elements and things around him. So he wasn't giving so much into gluttony. He wanted to see, going back to what you said earlier about the Garden of Eden, he wanted to take a bite of it himself out of that tree of knowledge.
That was very specifically right, and that's
Yeah.
exactly why this is the period where the story of Faust became so popular. Whether or not the real Faust was a living person, or whether he was in fact sort of a blending of several different historical figures, it was this time when the story of Faust became popular, and as a result, the stage was set for this to basically ignite the public imagination. And interestingly enough, and this is where the beautiful irony of this happens, is that the reason that the Faust story was so popular is that Faust doesn't simply want knowledge, although that's his primary goal here, but he also wants, he's an older man getting a little bit on the grizzled side. He wants the love of a beautiful young woman. He wants this sort of, a healthy, immortal life to take advantage of it. And Faust ends up becoming this lustful, this lustful sort of avaricious man. But the stories were full of sex and gluttony and violence and things like that, and it titillated the audience. And so what you were actually doing is you had this supposed morality play, which the church certainly wasn't about to turn people away from, because it was supposedly a lesson in the wages of sin, but it was actually igniting the titillating ideas of these people. So they were reading about a man ravishing an innocent young woman and ending up driving her to destruction and being showered with riches, and people loved it. So people were eating up this degenerate fantasy, and the church was saying, this is great, it's teaching you all sorts of wonderful lessons, and most of those lessons were about ravishing young women. So
That's right. That's right.
a little bit
Yeah.
of a little irony in there.
Yeah, but when we get to the German writer Goethe, whenever he's writing his version of the Faust idea, you can see it taking a very more human term, or a term for the better, because he really does want love in his life, something that's been escaping him all these years. And at the end, even after he sells his soul to the devil, he awakens to the bells ringing on Easter morning, because there's still the idea of salvation left, that you can somehow sell your soul to the devil, but yet you can still, because it's not really yours to sell, as we see in The Simpsons, whenever Homer Simpson so quickly sells his soul for a donut. In the end, it always belongs to somebody else. And that's one of those things that we get as we move farther and farther up into history, the idea that you can still have salvation, even whenever into the bargain as well too. Nobody's going to come and repossess you.
It's a really interesting point too that you bring up, because while it is very true that in Goethe's version of which was written about 200 years later, when I can never, I think Gretchen is the name of the woman that Faust sort of ravishes and ends up driving to destruction. He gets her pregnant out of wedlock, and in despair she ends up sort of dying for her own sins. But because she's such a virtuous woman, she may have been deceived by Faust, but she does end up going to heaven, and she pleads that that Faust is truly a good man at heart, and her pleadings eventually end up, sort of moving the heart of God, and God ends up giving Faust salvation in Goethe's version. But in Marlowe, no such redemption occurs. In Marlowe's original, story written in 1592, he is straight on the down elevator and doomed for all eternity. So it's interesting that Goethe brought this sort of redemption arc into it. And I don't know whether that just suggests that it was a difference in attitude at that time, or what audiences wanted, or the idea that maybe he had a more hopeful perspective. But it was a big change. And interestingly enough, I think that's funny, because that is actually really mirrored in maybe it is sort of the public consciousness at that time, because in the 14 and the 1500s, most of the great fairy tales and myths ended up with grisly ends. We had the story of I think it was Cinderella, who in Cinderella, the wicked stepdaughters who are so cruel to her are ended up made to dance in iron shoes that are heated up in a fire until their feet burn off and they die for it. So they're basically the stepmother and the stepsisters are sort of killed for their crimes against Cinderella. In Little Red Riding Hood, when Little Red Riding Hood and Grandma are eaten by the wolf, the moral of the story is you shouldn't have talked to the wolf. And that was the end of the story. It wasn't until much, much later with the revisions by people like the Grimm brothers that the huntsman comes along and rescues them, unzips the wolf, and the grandmother and Little Red Riding Hood step out unharmed. So it was definitely a different, sort of a gentler perspective that didn't have that rough ending, that moralistic, you're doomed by your actions that was happening during the Middle Ages.
That's right. Yeah, Marlowe is one of those interesting playwrights, and it's been said that if he would have been able to live, a little bit longer than his 20s, he may have even surpassed Shakespeare in his works. Because what Marlowe does is he really doesn't look at conventions. He likes to turn the world upside down. We don't have a lot of happy endings in Marlowe, and he doesn't really deal within the Aristotelian idea of tragedy either. His characters are very real. They act in very human ways, and there's really no kind of salvation for any of these people. You get what you get in life, and it was a shame he didn't live just a little bit longer.
Now, something about Faust himself, by the way, is that the Faust legend may have actually been inspired, if not by the real Johann Georg Faust, but maybe have actually been inspired by an even earlier story from the 600s, because there was supposedly a very real priest in the 600s who's often referred to as Theophilus of Adana, or Theophilus the Penitent specifically, and he was a Frankish priest living in Turkey at the time, Adana, Turkey, who was offered a position as a bishop, and for some reason he ended up turning it down. But when he turned it down, the new bishop ended up being somebody that he didn't really care for, and he thought, you know what, I should have had that position all along. And so, according to stories, he contacts a necromancer who helps him to contact the devil, and the devil grants him the bishopric in exchange for his soul. So he has to sign the devil's contract in blood and become the bishop, which is kind of a strange way to go about becoming a bishop. I guess probably not the most morally upstanding gentleman, but this story is very specifically the Faustian story. And in fact, even in some versions of it, he ends up, it's called Theophilus the Penitent, because he ends up pleading his case to the Virgin Mary, and the Virgin Mary ends up absolving him of making a pact with the devil, which seems a little maybe overly lenient. And he ends up not only remaining the bishop, but ended up getting his immortal soul back. But they say that is probably one of the earliest versions of the Faust legend, long before Faust himself was associated with it.
Yeah. It's also an insight into how the religion was viewed at the time. He sells his soul for a religious position because that's probably where the best orgies are.
And then of course when he ends up admitting to what he's done, he ends up getting to keep his bishop's mitre. That's a little bit. Right. It seems like a strange perspective, but I guess forgiveness runs pretty darn deep.
Right, but we have Michelangelo playing around with these ideas as whenever he's painting the Sistine Chapel as well too, by showing the Pope as a fox and everything. I mean, this goes. This is very entrenched in Catholicism. They knew what was going on. I think the common man knew what was going on, and a lot of this was very tongue-in-cheek, because the people that were sending people to be burned alive were doing far worse things in private.
Unfortunately true, and we're going to talk about that in just a few seconds. But there is a little kind of a little side note I wanted to point it out, which is that even Dracula, the legendary Dracula, is said to have made a pact with the devil, which is not surprising, given the sort of supernatural powers he acquired. But in the novel Dracula, something that never seems to be addressed in any of the film versions or adaptations, in Dracula, it is said that he gained his supernatural power at the Scholomance, and the Scholomance is a legendary folkloric school or academy of the dark arts presided over by Lucifer himself. And each class of 10 students goes through their sort of necromantic training, learns all these various dark arts, but one member of each graduating class is actually captured and enslaved by the devil, while the others go on to work their evil will on the world. And of course, Dracula ended up being, I guess, their star pupil and becomes the prince of all vampires. But I always thought it was fascinating that even Dracula has a pact with the Dark One.
I never heard that story in my life. I'm so glad you brought that up. It was kind of like the devil running Hogwarts.
I think it is the first Hogwarts, so maybe somebody should get on suing J.K. Rowling for nicking that idea. But so as I say, so Christianity at this point now had become quite a power and was spreading across Europe. And by the 9th century, Christian religion was a pretty major power throughout Europe and Britain. But conversion by force had become common at that time, and non-Christians were seen as a threat to the Holy Church of Rome. Of course, it was a couple hundred years later when they really coalesced their power that they began these various inquisitions, starting in Portugal and Spain, and then spreading through all throughout Europe. These inquisitions being inquisitions into heresy. And one of the most common versions of heresy was, of course, witchcraft, because folk traditions, and again, we talked extensively about this last week, folk traditions were declared witchcraft and labeled deviltry, resulting in torture and execution. And the most common version of execution was burning alive. So burning at the stake, while it may not have ever happened here in the States, where witch hunting certainly took its toll in the 1690s, but burning at the stake was very, very common all throughout Europe. And often people were tortured to the point of confession before they ever got to the stake. So unfortunately, it was a fairly grim ending for many of these people. But as the witch hysteria grew, neighbors began to imagine that anyone and everyone might be in league with Lucifer. And so every misfortune, every turn of luck, if a cow wasn't giving milk or your crops failed, every action seen as out of the ordinary or misfortunate might mark you as one of the devil's own. And so it was very, very common in the witch trials and in witch belief, both in Europe and America, to suggest that, of course, these people, often hapless people accused by their neighbors, had made pacts with the devil. And these pacts were often described in great detail, often very lascivious detail, kissing the devil on the butt, or having sex with the devil in order to achieve your diabolical power. Once again, these sort of lascivious ideas that were being sort of dragged from the dirty minds of the inquisitors and the accusers themselves ended up being the death sentence for so many of these accused witches. Your mic is off, I think, Ron. I'm not hearing you. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah, I was sorry. Yeah, I was going to say they were most always women as well, too. So we're going back to the idea of Eve again in the Garden of Eden.
The vast majority of those accused during both the European and the American witch trials were women. A few men did end up being called out on that. And of course, in our werewolf episode a couple of weeks back, we talked about the fact that lycanthropy was a common accusation of men. But even in those lycanthropy trials, it was often believed that they had been cursed by a malevolent witch, which was almost always portrayed as a woman. And so women were still getting the short shrift at that time. So, it's interesting because I like to draw the connection to the fact that this sort of religious hysteria and this persecution of people who are other, we talk about that a lot on this channel, these people who are considered different or in any way simply not perfectly aligned with the community's viewpoints, are often the ones who end up being targeted. And 300 plus years after the last of these heresy trials and the last witch burnings and executions here, I wish that I could say that we had come a long way, but it's very difficult sometimes to watch the news of the day, all the things that we're seeing. And so I wanted to point out that even today, many of these extremists who believe that violence and persecution is the way to, sort of a holy or godly life still exists to this day. And so I wish that we were beyond it, but medieval morality, unfortunately, seems to be still alive and well in certain corners. And so I'd like to point out, and this is something that we talked a little bit about this before we started tonight, is that it's very easy on this show. We do often call out some of the darkest aspects of Christianity on this show. And I do want to come clean and say I have absolutely wonderful friends who are Christians and have no problem with Christian faith, with the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth, who mostly spoke about loving one's neighbor. The problem is not with the Christian faith, but often it's with the extremists in the Christian religion, which is the dominant religion here in the Western Hemisphere. And that is a place where a lot of this poison comes from. And so I am not speaking out against Christianity, but I am speaking out against extremism in Christianity, or for that matter, in any other religion. The Abrahamic religions, unfortunately, do tend to lean into a lot of extremism. You see it in Judaism, and you certainly see it in Islam. And so this is what we're speaking against, is the violence and the hate, not the faith.
As we talked about before the show started, I'm a practicing Christian, and I think a lot of times we need to kind of shed some light on the darker sides. That's what Martin Luther did, and the Catholic Church deliberately went through a reconstruction and a restoration of itself because a person said what you're doing is wrong. These are not monolithic religions, and I don't think they ever intended to be. Christ never intended to be such ways. They should be talked about. There should be a dialogue constantly going on, because any religion that says love your enemy as yourself, and now we're killing people in God's name, that generally questions arise that need to be answered.
Absolutely. So as we come to a conclusion, because we're just coming up on the excuse me, on the 10 o'clock hour right now, I want to say that if you're fascinated in the sort of tradition of pacts with the devil, the most easy places to find it would be within sort of literature and popular media. There are many books on the subject. Of course, you can read Goethe's Faust, or you can go back and even read the somewhat chunky but readable Marlowe's tragic life and death of Dr. Faustus. You have books like the Mephisto Waltz, Rosemary's Baby, even more metaphorical versions like Stephen King's Needful Things or The Stand, which talk about sort of the devilish influences in the world. And of course, there are no shortage of films on the subject of pacts with the devil. You have comedies like the great 1960s English film Bedazzled, and then the later early 1990s remake Bedazzled with Brendan Fraser and Elizabeth Hurley. You have The Devil's Advocate with Keanu Reeves. The most recent of the Conjuring films deals with a story of murder influenced by sort of satanic forces. And so there is plenty out there if you're looking for popular depictions of this and sort of see different cultural aspects of it. And I think it's even fascinating how many heroic or popular characters actually tap into that Faustian idea. One of my very favorite comic book characters, the Ghost Rider, who's appeared in a few films at this point, is a young man who makes a deal with Mephistopheles, the very Faustian devil, to save the life of his father. And even Anne Rice's very beloved Interview with the Vampire and the Vampire Chronicles deal with the Faustian idea of giving up your humanity for immortality. And so there are endless versions of this story, and it does seem to hold just as much fascination for us today as it did in the Middle Ages, or else these popular versions of the story wouldn't still keep popping up year after year.
Absolutely. And if you want to look at C.S. Lewis's The Screw Tape Letters as well, too, you kind of get the devil's perspective on things.
Which I actually always fascinated by, those sort of flipping the script ideas. One quick thing I want to know, I know we're running a minute or two over, but a really interesting thing when I was doing the research for this that I came across was this fascinating idea. I started the program tonight with the story of Dorian Gray because I thought it was interesting about the contemporary sort of reflection of that, because there's some people who've been doing some really interesting modern interpretations of the Dorian Gray myth based on this age of social media. And it is fascinating to me because you have this age now where there are so many people, especially young, very youthful, beautiful people, who are basically banking their entire careers on simply being young and beautiful and using filters to portray themselves in like always the perfect light. But what's fascinating is that we know about so many of these people is that often what you're seeing on the screen is not what's happening behind the screen. And many of these, people still, deal with things like drug and alcohol abuse, or, family problems or loneliness and things like that. And so, again, it kind of flips the script on the idea. In this way, the portrait is eternally young and beautiful while the person is decaying behind the portrait, hidden away in the locked room. And so it is fascinating to see that. And it's something that the Dorian Gray myth certainly, I think, would be an instructive one in today's society, where this sort of vanity and narcissism has become such a huge business. And I know there's always been aspects of that, but it is getting to a point where there are people who literally aren't pursuing any other career. And you have to imagine that in 10 or 15 years, when their looks are not sustaining them anymore, what will they have? So it's certainly a worthwhile cautionary tale, as so many of these Faustian bargains are.
Hey, don't worry, they'll have a filter for that.
Oh, well, presumably we will. And then you'll have the true Dorian Gray story where the filter remains eternally youthful. So if there is one last thought for the evening, it's just remember that if in fact you are on a crossroads some dark night and you encounter a charming stranger, beware of these very important words: infernum pactum caveat emptor, which effectively means beware a deal that seems too good to be true, or a hell of a bargain. So, ladies and gentlemen, as always, we want to thank you really very much for sticking with us for a few extra minutes tonight. Ron, thank you for, again, an awesome exchange and a really good topic. John, thank you for suggesting this idea for us, and we're always looking for more. If anybody wants to drop some ideas in the comments or in the comments on YouTube, if you're watching this later on, we're always open to hearing them. We don't have a topic officially for next week, and actually, I'm not going to lie to you right now. I think there's a possibility that we will actually do an off week next week, because I've got a lot going on. We haven't discussed that yet, but we'll announce that on social media just in case. But we want to thank you guys as always. If you enjoyed our show tonight, jump down there into the comments below, like and subscribe, leave a comment, and let us know what you think. And we will hopefully see you either next week or the week after with another exciting episode of Monday Night Mysteries, Myths, and Monsters. And hope that you enjoyed this one tonight. So, Ron, we'll talk to you soon, and you all have a wonderful evening. We'll see you soon. Good night, guys.